So, what have I got here? I said my folder here is, I got this trick from my partner Andy Fletcher. It's the Beano version of my book. And it's what I use when I'm doing readings and so on. So you sort of, you know, you're not dropping pieces of paper and fiddling around with things. It sort of keeps it all nice and orderly. I've got to say it's very daunting to be getting up here in front of a room full of Larkin experts and probably exposing how little I know about him. But I've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and I've learned a lot. Thank you very, very much for all that you've said. And I do hope you find something here to enjoy. As Lynn said, I've sort of imagined this as a poetic conversation with Larkin in the spirit of the Guardians dining across the divide. And what I particularly like about that column is that at the end of the day, they all kind of seem to develop a respect and even an affection for each other. And I did find as I was doing this, I sort of thought that I'm going to be polar opposite to Larkin. I'm a feminist. I'm left-wing. I thought this is going to be clashing heads. But I found a lot to sort of like to have an affection for, and to really, I sort of find myself kind of liking him a lot more than I'd expected. So I've stuck with High Windows. I thought I'll just read the poems and sort of try and do them, you know, without recourse to all we know about his biography, about his views and everything. I sort of like just try and take the poems as they are on the page and see sort of like how I respond to them. And so I'll start. Larkin drops cubes of ice chimingly into 2 glasses, adds 3 fingers of gin to each, a lemon slice, and voids a tonic in foaming gulps. I love that description. I think, what a decent chap, a real good sort. I'm enjoying myself. But then he raises a toast to the whitest man he knows. I'm a bit shocked. And then I decide I'm going to believe that that's just an old-fashioned way of saying virtuous. Just skip on. Pouring another drink, Philip, we're now on first-name terms, says, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad." I go, "You've got my attention." What an enviably brilliant opening line for a poem. I tell him I first heard this be the verse in secondary school, and I was shocked but absolutely thrilled to discover that poetry could transgress the boundaries of what I was allowed to say and how I was allowed to say it. However, I'm not too keen on the assumption that this is always true for everyone. I sort of thought, well, you know. So Philip advises me not to have any children, and I tell him I think that ship sailed. Adrian Mitchell bursts in and exclaims, "They tuck you up, your mum and dad." So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And so I just repeat his contention: man, hands-on happiness to man. Adrian advises me to be kind to my parents and to have lots of cheerful children. So I say, Adrian, while I really enjoy, you know, you're debunking Philip's misery fest, I'm not so sure that I entirely agree with your sort of like overly cheerful optimism. I'd also like to say I object to both of you using man in this universal way. Philip, it could be an age thing. Adrian, you really should know better. I think at this juncture I'll share a little poem of my own about parenting from a woman's perspective that I think sits kind of between the two, and this is called Bonding. The day I was born, did you take me in your arms and love me? Or did I wrap myself around you like bindweed, white trumpets peering through the leaves? Adrian doesn't hang around, and as we talk, Philip and I discover a shared connection to Queen's University. I was there in 1982 to 86. And this connection with Hull. I moved to Hull in 2008, not knowing, you know, I was going to be here for 2 years for the creative writing MA. I ended up staying. This is my home now, and I love Hull very much. So then we moved on to sharing our first impressions of Hull. Here's temperamental differences. Larkin says he thought it was a hole, and the people were witless and crapulous. Hull was fish-smelling of the dump. I sneak a peek at my mobile phone to see what crapulous means. He goes, "What on earth are you doing?" I say, well, you know, as we get on into our third gin and tonic, I think, did he really mean it as an insult? So, because it's a sort of drunkenness, it's sort of drunken behaviour crapula, so I thought that's quite funny, really. We haven't time to actually have dinner, so I'll have to miss the opportunity to have a bit of fun at how he would have reacted to my vegan choices. So my first impressions of Hull. I loved Hull from the moment I got off the train. The beautiful historic station, the leafy university area, cafes, restaurants, pubs, and I'm sure the Hull that I arrived at was more developed than the Hull that Larkin arrived at. But I think that my compulsive optimism is already tussling with his trenchant pessimism. So we started talking about our age difference. I tell him I was born in 1963. And you know what's coming, don't you? He says, when sexual intercourse began. Up to then, he says, there was just a sort of a bargaining, a wrangling for a ring. So I laugh. Actually, growing up a Catholic in Northern Ireland, I say, pretty much sums up my experience as well into at least the late 80s. You know, it was just very, very similar to what he'd experienced. He says he imagines every young couple he sees are fucking. The girls are all taking the pill and wearing a diaphragm. Again, all this was forbidden to me as a young woman. He does seem like he's always looking at others. And someone yesterday described it, I loved it, as angry envy. I thought that was a lovely phrase. And, you know, he's wondering how they spend their money. And I have to ask him, you know, do you really think a second car in a house is how one gets a wife? I tell him he's too caught up with comparing himself with others. My granddad was very firm on that. I read him another of my poems. This is called On the Pavement. A trail of a trail of small stars glittering in the sun, other people's happiness. I said, can't you be happy for other people's happiness? You know, sort of, you know, besides, I'm not convinced you really want a wife. So it seems that he's managed to make up, oh yes, and I also thought he really has managed to make up for that lack of sex at the beginning, I think. He says to me, funny how hard it is to be alone. I could spend half my evenings if I wanted, holding a glass of washing sherry, counted over to catch the drivel of some bitch who's read nothing but witch. Steady on now. I think I'm talking like that because I've sort of got caught up with his middle class, middle 20th century world. That's not a phrase I would use. And I say, I don't like that word. You should not talk about women like that. Whatever, he says. Anyway, he said, I'd rather sit here under a lamp, hearing the noise of wind and looking out to see the moon thinned to an air-sharpened blade. That's beautiful, I say. I like the solitude myself. Here's how I imagine it. Wind and cloud and thistle seeds flying. The storms flattened the field behind the old white house. Above the crumpled landscape, the sky splits to let light through. Will I ever reach the house under the weight of this wounded sky? I'm always outside, preferring outside to the damp shelter within walls. I think he likes that damp shelter bit. I feel we're sort of finding some common ground here. And I think that while we're on the topic of nature, I have to say how I admire his descriptions at times. Hedges, snow-like strewn, high-builded cloud, moving at summer's pace. Lost lanes of Queen Anne's lace. Every year I see the Queen Anne lace and I always want to write something about it, but it's really not easy. So a great admiration there. I tell him I love your poem, The Trees. Like something almost being said is terrific for the trees coming into leaf, and that begin afresh is brilliant. Nobody's going to argue with that. He leans over and whispers, actually, I think it's corny. Huh? He thinks for a moment, nods to himself, he goes, yeah, it's bloody awful tripe. Damn, I think. I thought I could sort of catch something of, you know, the immanence and transcendence that I was always taught to associate with God. And I sort of felt that this is something was coming through in Larkin's view of nature. And I sort of thought he was pouring his religious kind of yearning into a reverence for nature. Somebody quoted this morning, Sam, was it? the denial of Larkin denying that this idea that he was discovering a blinding theology of flowers and fruit. And I thought that's beautiful, and I thought there is a sort of theology here of flowers and fruits, and I feel I'm indebted to that in some way. Anyway, given his view of the trees, I decided better not share my attempts to describe nature or to draw philosophical allusions from the natural world. And instead, I read a wee poem he might enjoy, as this is the one that appeared in About Larkin when my pamphlet was reviewed. I think the PLS folk would like what he likes, so fingers crossed. Tadpoles, a tad too small for pole vaulting across the pond. Do they dream of giant leaps when they'll grow into frogs for pale lads to pet? Doleful days in the dales, dappling rain, the plop sounds of nature. Tadpoles, adept at adapting, toppling over, looping the loop. Olé. He grumbles, drivel. He says, where's your scansion, your rhyme scheme, your stanzaic patterns? Then he says, don't you know the tension and the power of my poems comes from the interplay of common, unexceptional language and rigorously formal precision? Oh. So, well, I have to admit, I do think that this espousal of plain language is something that I've benefited from and I've taken on board in my poetry. I owe him a debt there. Then I sort of decide I'll try and I ask him, have you heard of the post-structuralist French theorist Julia Kristeva? I encountered her when I was studying a master's in Edinburgh in 1988. She differentiated between the symbolic and the semiotic aspects of language. The former is analogous to grammatic structure and related to the making of meaning and to power and the patriarchy, or as she puts it, the law of the father. The semiotic aspects of language are represented in the playfulness and disruptions of modernist and language poetry, breaking from traditional grammar. This was associated with the mother's body. I tell him, this may explain our different approaches to poetry. Philip, you're drawn to the strictures of traditional form, while I'm attracted to a style that invites the disruptions representing a playful feminine dynamic. He looks pretty pissed off. This is why I hate students, he says. So I see our time together is going to draw to a close soon. I try to appeal to his better instincts. This morning I heard someone described him as the poet of choice for those who don't like poetry. So I tell him this, and he smiles. Okay, I'm getting him back on side of it. So then I think, well, what I'll do, I'll finish off. I'll just give him the last word, and I'll just focus on just a few sort of snippets from the high windows that are the bits that I just particularly just think are wonderful. So the final verse of Money, first of all. I listen to Money singing. It's like looking down from the long French windows at a provincial town, the slums, the canal, the churches ornate and mad in the evening sun. It is intensely sad. Forget what did. And the empty pages, should they ever be filled, let it be with observed celestial recurrences. The day the flowers come and when the birds go. Tell me that's not a theology of flowers and fruit. High windows. Rather than words comes the thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it, the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless. And finally, from the old fools, to bring to bloom the million-petaled flower of being here. So that's just wonderful. Thank you very much.